Hey, look, it's a new name. How about that? Um, Looks like Alice Idaval. Hi, Alice. South Carolina has put in legislation that if the federal government moves to seize their legally purchased firearms, they will secede from the Union. Did South Carolina do that? South Carolina. I have to say it's kind of awesome this time. Wow. Twice. For those of you that are not up on your history, South Carolina was the state that led the secession and in the Confederacy in Civil War. Putting aside how devastating that would be, yet I would not regret seceding on those grounds one bit. If it came to that, if it happened, who would join South Carolina? ? What would the new nation be called? Should we make the case for claiming we're the true United States? If, heaven forbid, the split is permanent, how would the North American dynamic change if we suddenly find ourselves sitting next to a credible threat? For example, you mentioned something about Russia's motivations were fueled by their fear of invasion. Or on a more likely event, would the left finally realize how puny their country is when 95% of the USA splits off and they find themselves as urban islands in a sea of red? This is a subject we covered on Right Angle, I think. Or maybe it was the members only Right Angle last week, called An Amicable Divorce. It still seems exceedingly unlikely to me that this kind of thing could happen because during the Civil War, we had the kind of tensions that could rip a country apart and did rip a country apart. But those tensions were very largely geographically based. In other words, most everybody who believed in slavery lived in the slave-owning states in the South, and most of the people who were most opposed to slavery lived in the abolitionist states in the Northeast. So when the United States came apart over that issue, some people had to move, but most people were perfectly happy with the split because the slave-owning states left and the northern states stayed, and not a whole lot of people had to pick up and go to the other territory because there weren't that many abolitionists in the South, and there weren't that many slave owners. There weren't any slave owners in the North. It was illegal. The problem now is the country's divided as emotionally as it was in 1861, but we don't have the geographical divide. We all live amongst each other. The people we want to get away from are people who are either in front of us in traffic or standing next to us in the elevator or so on, which is part of the reason why I think it's actually an enormous tragedy, but I certainly feel it. When we mentioned it, somebody, I'm sorry I missed it, but somebody said I'd go to South Carolina. I'm beginning to suspect I would too. This thing seemed absolutely impossible to me prior to Donald Trump's election. But there's a serious move to get California out of the Union. We could only be so lucky. We'd lose a very big economy. I think California is still the 7th or 8th biggest economy in the world on its own. So we'd lose a big part of the economy, but all the liberals that are talking about California seceding from the Union, if only California were to secede from the Union, the Democrats would never win another election again. They start the race with a fifth, almost a quarter, in the bank. They start every race a quarter of the way there in the bank. They've got 50 electoral votes from California, and of the 270 you need, 50 is a big hunk. If California were to leave the Union and those 50 electoral votes were to go with them, the Democrats would have a much harder time. And if California were to leave the Union, had left the Union in the 2016 election, Donald Trump not only would have won the election by a much wider margin in terms of the way we judge elections, which is through electoral votes, but I believe he also would have won the popular vote. I think he would have won the popular vote because I think California's heavy, enormous population, it's so heavily blue, is what actually put Hillary over the top on the popular vote. So whether or not this is feasible, I don't know. But it's fun to talk about if it was feasible. it's absolutely true if you look at a map of the United States and you go to a much finer resolution than state by state. Instead of seeing this blocky thing where it's blocky blue and blocky red, you find exactly what you said, that the continent is just pretty much blood red from coast to coast. The entire American continent is red with large blue dots among it. And these are the high population centers in the city. So that's another problem. You know, all the city people would, we're generalizing obviously, but most of the city people would want to stay with the rest of the progressives. And those cities are dispersed in an enormous sea of red. And I guess that's kind of what you're saying. How would they like it if they woke up surrounded by all of this territory? I'm at the point now, and I know many people are at the point now, where if a state were to secede from the Union and take the Constitution with it, and actually obey the Constitution. In other words, if there was a conservative state that left the Union over conservative principles. I'd have to have a little discussion with this Russian girl I know, but I'm virtually certain that I would move there. Because I suspect that that one state alone would in a very short time become a serious economic competitor to the others. We were doing our right angle show today. One of Steve Green's topic was that we don't. Somebody had written that we don't pay enough in taxes. Liberal, imagine. And he's talking about the advanced economies of the world all pay 34%, and we only pay 26% or whatever the amount was, but something like that. He was talking about. This left-winger was talking about the advanced economies of the world. Here's what the advanced economies of the world do not like the savage barbarians that we have here. And this is a point I made on the show. I'll make it now, and I think that's going to do it, guys. I'm sorry to get to more of them, but a lot of other stuff. So here's what's interesting about that argument. It goes to the idea, when I make the case, it goes to the idea about this independence state idea. So these are 2015 data. I guess it's the latest data we have, like really completely solid numbers on. So let's look at what the advanced economies, the European economies, the socialist economies, the Scandinavian socialism economies. Let's see what incredible economic miracles they're performing, shall we? So we can all go galloping in that direction. Well, it turns out if you look at the 10 biggest economies in the world, backward, primitive, savage, coarse, gun-toting America. Oh, look, it's first with, again, 2015 figures, $18 trillion in GDP. And it turns out the 5% of us that make up the world population is 5% Americans, produce 24.3% of all of the world's economic output. So we're basically producing at 5 times our population share. I'm not great with statistics, but that's a general idea. So surely the economically advanced countries of Scandinavia must be next, right? No, it turns out it's not. Second is China. We produce 18 trillion. They produce 11 children. 11 trillion. Although it is about children, it's probably a Freudian slip. So the United States produces 24% of the world economy. China produces 14%. 15, really. They've got 4 times our population, and they produce about half, maybe a little more than half of what we produce. And they're just a communist state-run totalitarian slave machine. Now, the first really kind of socialist state you run into is the number 3 economy in the world, which is Japan. At 4.4 trillion, Japan produces almost 6% of the world economy. The problem with Japan is Japan used to be second, and Japan's share of the world economy continues to shrink because the Japanese are very good at making pretty much everything except for other Japanese. That seems to be the one thing that they can't get their arms around. So Japan is in a demographic death spiral. Japan, interestingly enough, has decided not to import other people to become new Japanese and have their country change under their feet. So rather than Japan evolving into Algeria, Japan is simply just getting so old that there won't be anybody in Japan anymore. So you can count on Japan's market share getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Germany, there you go. So here's a relatively socialistic country. 3.4 trillion, they make up less than 5% of the world population. United Kingdom makes up 4%. France makes up a little over 3%. India is almost 3%. Italy's 2.5%. So is Brazil. And our civilized, socialized, advanced economic neighbors in the north in Canada produce 2% of the world's population, GDP. They make less than 10% of what America makes. America makes 10 times what Canada does. Now you could say we have 10 times as many people, but I don't care about that. That's not relevant to the argument. So it's interesting, isn't it, that this left-wing communist is talking about the backward economy, the more advanced economies. When what he really should be saying, and there's no doubt about it, I mean, the graph is right here. We can talk about the advanced economy of the United States, or we can talk about the backward economies of the socialist countries that are doing 5% of what we do, or something like that. That point is interesting. And there's another point, and this is the point I was trying to make. The United States is the biggest economy in the world, $18 trillion in 2015 of GDP, gross domestic product, and we make about 25%, about a quarter of the world's economy. And that's America fighting with both hands and both feet tied. In other words, the enormous lead that America has in terms of manufacturing output and muscle and efficiency, economic muscle, that's with all of these taxes and all of these regulations. That's with this unbelievably heavy burden that we put on ourselves. It's like we're half again faster than the fastest runner on the track, and we are carrying a couple of anvils, one on each shoulder, and we're still cleaning everybody's clocks. If you were to get all of this taxation and regulations out of here, we'd be producing, I don't know, half easily of the world's economic output. If we were to become the country we were that made us this rich, back when we were rich, before we became the poorest country in the world, we went back to the same general size government as a proportion, the same general size spending as a proportion, same regulations as a proportion, we wouldn't be making $18 trillion of GDP. We'd be making $50 trillion of GDP. And as A.R. Simon says, hey, I like the A.R. there. Simon says, you awesome dude. We're doing all of this while we're paying for the defense of Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Canada. So it's the United States, we're paying for our own defense, China pays for its own defense, United States pays for most of Japan's defense, most of Germany's defense, most of the UK's defense, we pay for a significant part of France's defense. Don't pay much for India. We pay all of Italy's defense. We don't do much for Brazil, but we pay all of Canada's defense. So we're carrying that burden as well. The reason that I get so torqued about this is because if South Carolina or Texas or any place else were to secede from the Union and basically go to the kind of structure that allowed us to become so successful in the first place, then I would move there to bring the full weight and impact of the BillWhittle.com economy with me, because I think that whichever state left the Union would rapidly become, if it left under the terms of genuine free market and pro-business legislation, I think that one state would rapidly begin to outpace. First, they'd outpace California, and then they'd outpace the rest of the country. And I think it'd be awesome, frankly. You give me any state you want to, even someplace that sucks like Arkansas or something. The only reason I say that is I seem to remember a New Wave song that had a lyric, send me off to Arkansas or someplace else that sucks. But if you were to have one state that was very limited, flat federal tax, or state tax, you don't have a federal anymore, and you got regulations out of the way, I think you would find yourself living in the most prosperous, cleanest state on the continent, and more people would go there, and it would become more and more successful. And as all of the producers and all of the hardworking people and the smart people, but mostly the hardworking people, left to go to this one place, the states they left behind would lose their power plants, their economic, spiritual power plants, and they would collapse ever the faster. And as soon as that happened, all of the liberals that live in these places would all of a sudden move to South Carolina because of the superb economic opportunities provided therein. And as soon as they got to South Carolina, they'd start voting like Californians, and they'd screw up South Carolina. That's why, if any kind of a secession like that happens, you better make damn sure that you write a law that says that what happens to your new country doesn't happen to the state of Texas, which is namely, we have a legislature that meets once every 2 years for a couple of weeks. We stay out of people's way. We have very low taxes, a lot of room, pro-business, incredible booming economy. So far, so good. But then people from absurd economies like California move to Texas. Again, so far, so good. And then they start voting like Californians and do everything they can to ruin the economic climate that drew them there in the first place, because that's how stupid progressives are. They're that stupid. I think that's going to do it for me. I've got a couple of thumbnails I need to do for Right Angle before I head home, and gone for another couple of days, but then we're back, and we're looking at kind of a sort of a, I guess kind of an emotional and moral restart on Monday the 23rd of April. A lot of traveling behind us. A lot of things have been, worked out one way or another, and we're going to try and get back on the horse, get back to basics, and start again, and try to, bless you, Simon says, and we'll stay in it. We're as worried as I was, as terrified as I was with all of this stuff, and I still am. I do remember being in Hawaii and just looking at this whole thing from above and saying, all right, if we have to handwrite out these things and share them under newspapers on bus seats, we'll samizdat the entire thing. We'll just make these Soviet underground publications. We're never going away. And we're never going to stop fighting you miserable, low-life communist bastards who have nothing else to do but tell other people how to live their lives. We're not going anywhere. We're just going to have to fight a lot smarter than we're fighting now. Okay, that'll do it. So thanks very much for joining us. I think I'm here next week. Don't see any reason why we can't be back next week. I'm now going to hit the 7 or 8 buttons that I need to hit to stop this whole thing. And there's one of them. So there it is. So again, thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week on episode number 182. Today, 183 next time. We'll see you. Bye.